so much. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone, and my name is Reshara Alviarez, and I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Oh, okay. So I am a fourth-year PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and I'm sharing with you today my research as a part of my dissertation, and it is a work in progress. I just began the fieldwork just about 2 weeks ago, so I appreciate any comments or feedback that you might have. The title of the research is A Language-Friendly Approach, Bridging the Linguistic Divide in Education in Trinidad and Tobago. So before I go any further, Tobago geographically for you. So
Give me 1 second. The audio. Check.
thank you. So as I was saying, I wanted to situate Trinidad and Tobago geographically. For those of you who may not be familiar, it's not going to, oh, there we go. So Trinidad and Tobago is a twin island republic in the Lesser Antilles in the Caribbean Sea, and it's actually the most southerly islands in the Caribbean Sea. So Trinidad is actually closer in proximity to Venezuela than it is to its own twin island of Tobago. And that geographic proximity between Venezuela and Trinidad has allowed for a very significant relationship to be developed over the years between Trinidad and Venezuela. When I first began this research 4 years ago, I viewed Trinidad as a monolingual society, particularly being an immigrant myself to Toronto. When people asked me what language do they speak in Trinidad, I would have automatically said English. And a couple of months into the research, I came to classify Trinidad as perhaps a bilingual or a bidialectal society, wherein you have the Trinidadian English Creole and the Tobagonian English Creole coexisting with the standardized English that is taught in schools. Now, 4 years into this research, I can safely say that Trinidad and Tobago is in fact a plurilingual society, where not only do you have the Trinidadian English Creole and the Tobagonian English Creole existing as the popular languages of communication, but you also have the Patois, or the French Creole, which still exists as a heritage language. You have the Venezuelan Spanish, which now exists far more prominently in Trinidad as a result of mass migration from Venezuela since 2015. You have the Portuguese existing as a heritage language, Syrian and Lebanese Arabic and Cantonese existing as migrant languages, Trinbago Sign Language existing amongst the members of the deaf and hard of hearing community in Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad Hindustani and Bhojpuri, which exist as both the heritage languages and also are still being used in different parts of Trinidad today. Yoruba, Igbo, and Kungo figuring prominently into the Trinidadian English Creole and the Tobagonian English Creole. And finally, the indigenous languages of the Caribs, so the Cariña language, Arawak, the Lokono and Taino languages, and finally Warao and the Warao language. So the problem remains, or the question remains rather, if all of these languages are existing within the communities of Trinidad and Tobago, why does the education system continue to promote the standardized English as the only language deserving space? So in situations where acceptability of Creole languages is low, attitudes toward Creole language use in the classroom can impose or pose additional challenges for children's literacy development. And as a result of these attitudes, the lexifying English or the standardized English is believed to be held to a degree of prestige and believed to be the only language really providing that social mobility and socioeconomic advancement. And finally, as I mentioned, as a result of the Venezuelan migration to Trinidad, and Trinidad now has the highest per capita population of Venezuelan migrants in the world, these children of Venezuelan migrants are not currently accepted in the school system of Trinidad and Tobago. So the government has said that there is no room for these Venezuelan migrants. And as a result, the only accredited educational opportunity that exists for Venezuelan migrant children in Trinidad at the moment is the Equal Place Program. And the Equal Place Program is an initiative of the UNHCR and several other NGOs across Trinidad and Tobago. And the problem with the Equal Place Program is that A, it's temporary, and B, it provides challenges of access for these children. So the monolingual system of education in Trinidad is currently not designed to welcome these children in the event that the government does eventually say that they will make room for Venezuelan migrants. The overall goal or aim of this research is to determine what the acknowledgement and valuing of languages currently looks and sounds like in the classroom, and to consider what opportunities exist for a language-friendly approach within reason, given the expectations of the curriculum. And when I say given the expectations of the curriculum, I mean that the curriculum itself has evolved since the 1970s. So in the 1970s, Dr. Lawrence Carrington, for example, conducted a language survey of communities in Trinidad to determine which languages were in use and which languages should have some sort of presence in the classroom. Now, in the 2013 iteration of the curriculum, there is mention of the Creole to a much greater extent, where students from as early as first year or infants in Trinidad are expected to be able to communicate orally in the Trinidadian English Creole, but only where appropriate. And that question of appropriateness has posed many challenges for teachers then tasked to bring this English Creole into the classroom in a significant way. So the pedagogical intervention that I use is the Language Friendly School, and the Language Friendly School is an initiative of the Rutu Foundation. And the Language Friendly School is co-founded by Dr. Ellen Rose Campbell and Dr. Emmanuel Lepichon-Horstman. And it currently exists in just about 30 schools in different parts of the world. There are schools here in Ontario, Canada. There are schools in the Netherlands. There's a school in Spain, in China, most recently in Suriname, as well as in Sabah in the Caribbean. And the reason why the Language Friendly School approach is able to work in all of these very linguistically and culturally different settings is because it's open to flexibility, and it accepts and promotes the idea that no one school can look the same or sound the same. It requires acceptance of three things. The first being that no child should be punished for speaking their language in the school. No parent or family member should be admonished for speaking their language with their children. And finally, the school should serve as a space where children feel accepted for who they are. And beyond these three principles, the way that the Language Friendly School is rolled out, or the way that it looks in the school, is completely at the discretion of the school's Language Friendly team. And this Language Friendly team comprises of the school's administrator, one or two teachers, and potentially the school's librarian, who might be committed to diversifying the resources in the school's library. And the Language Friendly School, it's a bottom-up approach, and it's also a whole school approach. So this is an example of a roadmap that you can be found on the Language Friendly School website. And so we see at the very bottom, it really begins with questioning the attitudes, the beliefs, the language attitudes of teachers, of administrators, and of all community partners involved in the educational context. So encouraging teachers to think about their own experiences with language, their own experiences with education. And then moving up to the classroom level, encouraging teachers to ensure that the classroom represents all of the languages of the students and of their families. And then, of course, moving up to the whole school level, where those languages are visible on the walls of the school, and parents and family members are invited into that school space because of the languages that they speak, rather than in spite of those languages. With regard to the research framework, so I work toward dialogic praxis, turning reflection into action and releasing the agency of minoritized groups. And as I mentioned, I couch this in plurilingualism, believing that even the most partial knowledge of a language serves as tools for facilitating communication. I work from an understanding of critical language awareness, believing that language cannot and should not be taught in the absence of criticality. So students should not only be introduced to the many languages within their society, but they need to also understand the hierarchies that position these languages sometimes against one another. Funds of knowledge theory, including the languages and whole identities of the child. And finally, mother tongue education, supporting that idea that when students are given opportunities to access important concepts in education in their mother tongue, they're far more successful than when that language is taken away from them. And with regards to the methodology, addressing research question number 1, what are the patterns of language use and attitudes among educators and families at school and in the community, and among children in the classroom and in the schoolyard? So as I mentioned, in the 1970s, and then again in 2010 in Trinidad, a language survey was done of the population to determine what languages were in use. The challenge with Creole-speaking communities in particular is that likelihood, or that willingness to admit that one speaks a Creole, is sometimes very low. And the likelihood, instead of them saying that they speak a standardized language, is sometimes higher. So in order to determine what the patterns of language use are currently in the society, I use a mix of linguistic landscaping and soundscaping. So linguistic landscaping involves a photographing of different aspects of the community, including storefront signs, memos posted on government buildings or in schools, graffiti, billboards. And then linguistic soundscaping entails completing sound walks within a 5-kilometer radius of the school community, as well as on the schoolyard and within the classroom, to really determine what languages are actually in use in comparison with the languages that are reported to be or believed to be in use. Findings from linguistic landscaping and soundscaping are then shared with the teacher collaborators, who are 2 teachers in Trinidad, and one is a first-year teacher, so infants 1 or the equivalent of senior kindergarten, and the other is a second-year teacher or infants 2, the equivalent of a grade 1 teacher. And findings from linguistic soundscaping and landscaping will then be used to help us workshop or develop a language-friendly plan that meets the needs of this particular community, taking into account the languages, the goals of the community, the goals of the family members, and the goals of the school itself. This period of intervention will take place from September 2023 until December 2023, followed by a period of evaluation where we determine the sustainability of a language-friendly approach within Trinidad. In response to research question number 2, so what are students' perceptions of their own language use and what are their experiences with speaking their home languages in the primary classroom or learning space? And for this, I rely on samples of student work. Some activities that may be presented to students may include the student language portrait, which encourages students to then think about their own language awareness and asking students, what are the languages that they speak in school? What are the languages that they speak at home? What are the languages they hear most often? What language do they love? What language would they like to learn? And what language do they like to write in? And encouraging students to think beyond the language that is just used in the classroom and to expand and think about the languages that are all a part of their language repertoire. A second activity could be draw a picture of the people in your life. What languages do you use when you're speaking with them? So again, encouraging that language awareness where they think about their grandparents and what language do they use with them? What language do they use with their teachers? What language do they use with their friends when they're outside? Multilingual word walls exists as a living document within the classroom. And in the context where I can conduct my own research, the teachers are already teaching Hindi twice a week, which is board mandated. And they are also teaching Spanish twice a week, which is ministry mandated. And they're dealing with students using Trinidadian English Creole, as well as teaching the standardized English. So a multilingual word wall will serve as an opportunity for students to really think critically about the language patterns and the languages that they're exposed to on an everyday basis. And finally, in response to research question number 3, in what ways does the intentional integration of a language-friendly approach affect students' choice in language use and their participation in classroom activities? And for this, I rely upon teachers' observations. So the participating teachers will collaborate on a Microsoft whiteboard, which might look something like this, where they have the opportunity to record their ideas, their findings, their observations as they implement these language-friendly practices or approaches within the classroom and within the school context, to compare and contrast their experiences with their own beliefs and their attitudes toward language use. As I said, I began this research just recently, so I'm just sharing some of the very initial emergent findings. And these are some samples of the linguistic landscaping. So when I visited the school, for example, I had students approach me with a coloring book that was available in both English and Spanish, and they were showing me how they were able to say the words, and they were showing me how to spell the words. And then on the right-hand side, you see evidence of how the Trinidadian English Creole is used almost exclusively in marketing. So on the top right corner, you have a storefront sign and it uses Trinidadian English Creole. Again, on the billboard on the highway down below, and then sort of like a PSA, take the jab, used again to communicate in the Trinidadian English Creole to the population. With regards to teachers' language attitude, so based on the initial survey and meeting with the teachers agree that Trinidadian English Creole is important to the people of Trinidad, and there is concern that children may not learn to speak standardized English. So even for these teachers who teach first year and second year, there is that concern that if they don't encourage the use of the standardized English in the classroom, these students will not be successful on their secondary entrance assessment exam, which is done at the end of grade 5. And it's a very high stakes exam because it determines the secondary school that those students then attend. So that pressure rests with these teachers to ensure that students are able to communicate both orally and in writing in the standardized English, because that exam is done almost completely entirely in standardized English. Standardized English is reported to be important for getting into university, whereas Trinidadian English Creole is moderately important for getting into university. So again, we see that discrepancy between what is appropriate for where and what is important or useful for which space. These were three themes that emerged again from that initial meeting with the participants. Appropriateness, so again, thinking about what is appropriate for where, they said that Trinidadian English Creole is so important for making friends, and they use that language every day to communicate with their own families. But when they think about usefulness and they think about, for example, tertiary education, they cannot remove the standardized English from that context. And identity, again, they talk about the importance of knowing Trinidadian English Creole to support that Trinidadian identity. And just before I conclude, I just wanted to, again, share the linguistic soundscaping. So it's very space or context dependent. We see how on the schoolyard at lunchtime, Trinidadian English Creole is used almost exclusively by the students. However, within the classroom, they immediately switch and they know that they're using the standardized English. Same goes for a whole class discussion. In the classroom with another adult, so not the teacher, they begin by using standardized English, but when sharing any information or stories about their lives outside of the classroom context, they're using the Trinidadian English.
Can I hear? Wow.
And the evidence of community engagement, so what the school is already doing, I had a chance to visit at a time when they were preparing for the Bal Vikas competition. And this is a competition done amongst the Hindu schools in the board. And they were singing a song in both Hindi and English. And the teacher informed me later that it was a parent of a student at the school who helped them translate that song into Hindi. And then they worked with a community partner to really continue to write the song and develop the music for it, which again shows evidence of community partnership or school to home and home to school communication, where language really serves as the foundation. And so that brings me to the end of the presentation. And I think there's no doubt that Trinidad and Tobago is a plurilingual society, and there's also no doubt that Venezuelan children in Trinidad deserve an opportunity to be educated somewhere that is not temporary and also that is linguistically and culturally inclusive. And I do hope that the findings from this research support replicated studies in different parts of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I